There are two nations that can do ground warfare in the modern era, and neither of them are in NATO. One
Mm.
of them is Russia, and one of them is Ukraine. And if we're not careful, it's going to be Ukrainian troops having to defend our front lines in the Baltic because they're the only people who can turn up with 10,000 drones. And if Putin ever kicks off aimed at, he ever launches an operation against Latvia, Lithuania, or Estonia, or indeed Finland, we're going to be pretty defenseless because we don't do drone warfare and we are still just thinking about how to do it when the Russians and the Ukrainians are now developing new operating procedures, new tactics,
Yes, yes.
which are built around this new warfare.
In the 3.5 years since Russia began its invasion of Ukraine, Moscow has attacked Kiev on multiple fronts, on the Black Sea, in Kharkiv, in Luhansk and Donetsk, just some examples. But the Kremlin has also engaged Kiev in battle through psychological warfare, cyber attacks and the abduction of children. The former Conservative MP for the Isle of Wight, Bob Seeley, calls this combination of traditional military force and non-military tools the new total war. It's the title of his book, which is just out now. Bob joins me now. Bob, welcome. Your book's... Yes, nice to talk to you. Your book's title tells us a bit more about what's going on. Exactly. What do you mean by total war? When did we first see this type of war?
It certainly has its roots in Soviet ideas of warfare, but it is fundamentally different from the Soviet days because what Putin and his regime have done is effectively integrate military and non-military tactics and tools within a single military doctrine. So information warfare, political warfare, economic warfare, espionage, this sits within military doctrine. And the number one characteristic of new Russian warfare, as I explain in the book, is the integration of military and non-military tools of state power. And in an authoritarian state, Michael, where as a dictator, like Putin, you control all the tools of state power, that gives you enormous influence, whether it's in psychological disinformation, whether it's in the long-term recruitment of Western politicians as agents of influence, whether it's buying up chunks of industry, whether it's gas pipelines, whether it's assassinations, whether it's sabotage, or whether it's actual warfare. All these things Russia has effectively combined in a single way of war, and they do so to try to make their form of war as efficient as possible, because if you can corrupt a society like they're trying to do in Georgia at the moment, you don't need to invade it and take the political and the military risks with that.
Yes, indeed. Well, Ukraine isn't quite the same dictatorship, in fact, far from it. Has Ukraine itself been able to give what it gets? In other words, can it effectively retaliate with its own total war against Russia?
That's a really good point, Michael. And the simple answer is no. The Ukrainians are inventing a Ukrainian way of war, which is going to be very influential for the West because it's effectively going to be a Western way of warfare as well, where you're using innovation. In this case, it's drones, electronic warfare to try to offset Russian mass, just the sheer amount of Russian soldiers that are coming over the front lines that Putin is willing to expend in an incredibly bloodthirsty and frankly absolutely horrific way. The problem for the Ukrainians, and it's a problem the West has as well, is that we didn't realize, just as they didn't realize, that Putin thinks he's been in conflict with Ukraine and with NATO since around 2007. And indeed, the Ukraine war, I date the Ukraine war as starting in 2005 after something called the Orange Revolution here.
Yes.
Ukrainians first started saying, actually, we really want to be part of the West and not part of the Russian world. And I think there have been three stages to this war. The first one, 2005 to 2013, where Putin used political tools of warfare, what Russians in the Soviet Union used to call active measures. So espionage, corruption, getting compromising information of people, controlling political parties, influencing senior politicians. Add to that economic warfare, buying up chunks of Ukrainian industry through oligarchs who were specifically used and tasked by the Russians to do that. And in fact, Putin nearly succeeded in dragging Ukraine back into the Russian world. There was another uprising in Kiev in late 2013, as some of your listeners will remember. The then very corrupt guy who ran Ukraine, Yanukovych, was kicked out. And then you had the first Russian partial invasion using sort of the fig leaf of separatist movements in eastern Ukraine. That also didn't work, and then you had the 22 invasion. So effectively, you've had three stages. You've had non-military tools, you've had paramilitary and non-military tools, and then from 2022, you had the full invasion. But also, Putin is still using non-military tools here, and indeed against the West as well.
Yes, very interesting, yes. And interesting that you date it all the way back to 2007. And would you say it goes perhaps even further back, Russia's revanchist policies, perhaps since the fall of the Soviet Union? I mean, how long-standing do you think this interest has been, and what has now provoked it?
Again, I mean, great question. If you look at some Swedish research, for example, they will say there were 50 attempts to use gas, so the control of gas supply and its pricing, as effectively a diplomatic tool, a weapon of sorts to manipulate Ukraine. And they were doing it elsewhere as well. They were doing it in Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Moldova. They were even doing it in Germany. Nord Stream 2 was fundamentally a strategic aim whereby Russia seemed to gain or wanted to gain significant influence in the German business world, which would then reflect in the realities of German politics. And arguably they succeeded. It's one reason why Merkel refused to see what was happening for so long and actually just doubled down on her policy of investment in gas supply lines. I think then helped convince Putin that the West would not react when he invaded Ukraine. So you're talking about a lot of strategic miscalculation on both the Russian side, but also in Europe and indeed the West more widely. There's an argument to say that the Russians never really intended to give Ukraine independence. Or wanted to, make that independence a long-term thing. They didn't have the power in the 1990s and indeed the 2000s. And so they tried to use other methods as well. But I think a realistic date for the start of Putin's new Cold War with the West is 2007. And I think from 2005, he pretty much made up his mind that he wanted Ukraine back within the Russian world and that Russia would use all the tools at its disposal to make that happen. And if need be, take on NATO as well.
Yes. Well, as part of the book, you've been to Ukraine, to the front lines, and that's really what's informed you, I suppose. I mean, how has travelling to Ukraine pushed you into writing this?
Well, to be honest, I'm here now, and I'm giving a talk with one of the regiments that I spent some time with called Hatia tomorrow afternoon or tomorrow evening in Kiev. I think it's really helpful, and spending time with units on the front was helpful for understanding how the military aspects of this conflict are changing and have changed dramatically in the last few years. And that is primarily in the use of drones, not only air drones, these quite small quadcopters, which are then armed and used to drop bombs, so bomber drones, or indeed just to fly suicide-like kamikaze drones just flying straight into tanks and armored personnel carriers, but also how electronic warfare is changing it. And I think the speed of evolution here is A, fascinating, but B, is simply changing ground warfare forever.
Yes. Do you think... So go on. Yes.
There are two nations that can do ground warfare in the modern era, and neither of them are in NATO. One of them is Russia, and one of them is Ukraine. And if we're not careful, it's going to be Ukrainian troops having to defend our front lines in the Baltic because they're the only people who can turn up with 10,000 drones. And if Putin ever kicks off aimed at, he ever launches an operation against Latvia, Lithuania, or Estonia, or indeed Finland, we're going to be pretty defenseless because we don't do drone warfare and we are still just thinking about how to do it. When the Russians and the Ukrainians are now developing new operating procedures, new tactics, which are built around this new warfare, where effectively you have flying mortars, which is effectively what a kamikaze drone is. You've got thousands of flying mortars circling above your head using AI, increasingly from next year onwards, to target individual soldiers and individual weapons of war. And it's now just final point on this. You used to be able to drive to the front line in an armored a personnel carrier. Now you have to walk 20 kilometers to the front line because an armored personnel carrier is simply going to be an immediate target for an increasingly drone-saturated battlefield. And it's a battlefield that we in the West simply don't understand yet.
I'm afraid we'll have to leave it there, but that's very interesting and some very useful reflections, particularly since you've been in Parliament and have seen the insight from the other side. Anyway, thank you very much, Bob Seeley, former Conservative MP and author of The New Total War, which is out now.